In the snowy quiet of Golden Pines Community Hospital, veteran nurse Emily Harper defies protocol to save Korean War hero Walter Briggs from a cardiac arrest. Her swift action brings him back, but Chief Nurse Deborah Klein suspends her for overstepping her assigned ward. As whispers of injustice spread, Colonel Robert Mason intervenes, revealing Walt's heroic past and demanding Emily's reinstatement. The hospital, stirred by her courage, begins to change. But who was the mysterious figure watching her, and what secrets does Walt's survival unearth? The fight for justice is just beginning, and Emily's legacy is far from written. Love this gripping tale of courage and change. Support our channel to keep these stories alive. Subscribe, share, and join our community to explore more heart-pounding narratives. Your support fuels our passion for storytelling. Don't miss out on the next chapter. Visit our page and show your love today. Emily Harper slipped on her gloves, the soft leather brushing her skin as dawn's golden light spilled through the windows of Golden Pines Community Hospital. The corridors were hushed, save for the gentle hum of monitors and the occasional squeak of a cart rolling by. At 55, Emily moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent over 30 years navigating these halls, her sneakers padding softly against the linoleum. Her hazel eyes flicked to the chart in her hand, then to an elderly man being wheeled past on a stretcher. Walter Briggs, 82, Korean War veteran, admitted for chest tightness. The words on the chart stirred a faint unease in her chest, though she couldn't quite place why. She tucked the feeling away and kept moving, her mind already shifting to the rhythm of the morning shift. Golden Pines sat nestled under a thick layer of Montana snow, its unassuming brick facade blending into the pale winter landscape. Inside, the hospital was stirring to life. The coffee machine gurgled at the nurse's station, its bitter aroma mingling with the sterile scent of disinfectant. Emily's heart beat steadily, grounded by the familiar cadence of her work. Decades of births, broken bones, heart attacks, and fleeting moments of victory had woven themselves into her soul. Yet today, something felt different. A subtle tremor in her gut she couldn't shake. As she passed room 214, she paused, her gaze lingering on the new patient. Walter Briggs, Walt as his chart called him, lay still, his chest rising and falling faintly. His faded Korean War veteran cap perched crookedly on his thinning white hair, a quiet testament to a life of service. Oxygen tubing rested beneath his nose, and his weathered face held a serene calm in sleep. Emily's lips curved into a faint smile, a flicker of warmth cutting through her unease. She turned and continued down the hall, the chart in her hand growing heavier with each step. Halfway through reviewing another patient's notes, a sound shattered the quiet, a piercing, unmistakable flatline. The world seemed to pause, the air growing thick. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto the source. Room 242. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. Her sneakers pounding the floor as she sprinted down the corridor. The chart slipped from her hands, fluttering to the ground like a forgotten leaf. She shoved open the door to Walt's room, her breath catching at the sight of his motionless form. His chest was still, the heart monitor screaming a relentless, flat tone. "Code Blue," she shouted, her voice slicing through the air like a bell. Without a second's hesitation, she lowered the bed rail, her hands finding Walt's chest. Her fingers interlocked, and she began compressions, her body falling into the practiced rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted under her breath, her arms steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. No doctor appeared. No backup arrived. A young nurse poked her head into the room, her eyes wide with panic. "Get the crash cart," Emily barked, her voice sharp but controlled. Time stretched, each second an eternity, as she fought to keep Walt's heart beating. Her arms burned, sweat beaded at her temples, and her own heart thundered in her chest. She could feel the weight of Walt's life beneath her hands, fragile yet stubborn, refusing to slip away. "Come on, Walt, stay with me," she murmured, her voice low and urgent, as if her words alone could tether him to the world. The monitor's flatline wailed on, unyielding. Emily's mind raced, a torrent of thoughts and emotions colliding within her. She thought of Walt's cap, the stories it held, the battles he'd survived. She thought of her own father, a man of few words who'd faced his own wars, and the way she'd held his hand in his final moments. This wasn't just a patient. This was Walt, A man who'd lived, loved, and fought, and she wasn't about to let him go without a fight of her own. The door swung open as footsteps hurried in, but Emily barely noticed. Her focus was singular, her hands pumping with measured precision. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat. Her muscles screamed, but she didn't falter. The shuffle of feet and the clatter of the crash cart reached her ears, yet still no one took over. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't have time. Sweat dripped down her brow, stinging her eyes, but she blinked it away. "You're not done yet, Walt," she whispered, her voice trembling with determination. Nearly 2 minutes had passed, 2 minutes that felt like a lifetime, when Walt's chest jerked beneath her hands. A soft, ragged gasp escaped his throat, and his mouth opened slightly. The monitor stuttered, then picked up a faint, uneven rhythm. "There you are," Emily breathed, her shoulders sagging as relief flooded her body. Her hands lingered on Walt's chest for a moment, as if to anchor him to this fragile victory. But before she could fully exhale, a sharp voice cut through the room like a blade. "Emily, step away." Chief Nurse Deborah Klein strode in, her heels clicking against the linoleum with a cold, deliberate cadence. At 45, Deborah was Emily's opposite in every way, crisp, composed, and fiercely devoted to protocol. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features, and her icy blue eyes scanned the scene with surgical precision. They landed not on Walt, whose chest now rose and fell with shallow breaths, but on Emily, still crouched by the stretcher, her hands slick with sweat. "Emily Harper," Deborah said, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "You were not assigned to this patient." Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She straightened slowly, her chest heaving as she met Deborah's gaze. "I was closest," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion coursing through her. Inside, a storm brewed. Pride in what she'd done, frustration at Deborah's tone, and a flicker of fear about what this moment might cost her. Deborah's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. To her, rules were the backbone of the hospital, the guardrails that kept chaos at bay. Emily's actions, heroic or not, were a breach of that order. For Emily, though, the rules had always been secondary to the human lives in her care. She'd seen too many moments where protocol failed to save a life, too many times when instinct and heart made the difference. As she stood there, the weight of Walt's faint breaths behind her, Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This wasn't just a clash of protocol and instinct. It was the moment that would ripple through her life, Walt's, and the quiet halls of Golden Pines, changing everything. The sterile hum of the heart monitor punctuated the tense silence in the hospital room, each beep a stark reminder of Walt's fragile hold on life. His labored breaths rasped in the background as Emily stood before Deborah, her supervisor's words slicing through the air like a scalpel. "You violated protocol," Deborah said sharply, her voice edged with authority. "You were outside your assigned ward. You had no authorization to intervene." Emily's gaze swept across the room, taking in the familiar faces of her colleagues. Some averted their eyes, their discomfort palpable, while others offered fleeting glances of quiet sympathy. The weight of their stares pressed against her, but she stood resolute, her heart thumping louder than the monitor's steady rhythm. Deborah reached into her pocket and produced Emily's badge, her expression unyielding. "Effective immediately. You're suspended pending investigation." "Turn in your eye." Emily's fingers grazed the worn edges of her badge, the metal cool against her skin. For a moment, her mind flickered with memories, countless nights spent comforting patients, the gratitude of families, the camaraderie of her team. Her lips pressed into a firm line, and though her pulse raced, she refused to let her composure crack. 30 years in this hospital, they had forged a resilience that wouldn't falter now. With deliberate care, she unclipped the badge and placed it gently into Deborah's outstretched hand. "I'd do it again," she said, her voice low but steady, her eyes locking with Deborah's in a silent challenge. Then turning on her heel, she walked out, her head held high, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The hospital hallway stretched endlessly before her, the soft shuffle of her sneakers echoing in the quiet. Without her badge clipped to her scrubs, Emily felt unmoored, as if the place she'd called home for over 3 decades had suddenly become foreign. Each step carried her further from the life she'd known, and the absence of that familiar weight on her chest left her adrift, like a ship without an anchor. She passed nurses and orderlies, their hurried steps a stark contrast to her measured pace, and though she sensed their sidelong glances, she kept her gaze forward, unwilling to meet their pity or judgment. In the break room, Emily sank into a chair by the window, her eyes drawn to the snowy Montana parking lot outside. The world beyond the glass was blanketed in white, serene and indifferent to the storm raging within her. Her fingers absently traced the handle of a coffee mug, a gift from a patient's family years ago. The words "best nurse ever" were barely legible now, faded from countless cycles through the dishwasher, but she could still feel their shape beneath her fingertips. The mug was a relic of a time when her work felt uncomplicated, when saving lives didn't come with a price tag of bureaucracy and blame. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. A message from Janice, a night shift nurse, and one of the few colleagues Emily trusted implicitly, glowed on the screen. "You did the right thing, but management is panicking. I'm sorry." Emily's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing a brief reply. "Thank you, it's okay." But was it? In all her years of nursing, through flu outbreaks, staff shortages, and hospital renovations, Emily had never faced a reprimand, let alone a suspension. She'd trained countless young nurses, her steady hands guiding them through their first codes, her calm voice reassuring them in moments of chaos. And now, for saving a man's life, she was packing up her locker, her career reduced to a single moment of defiance. Through the glass walls of the break room, she caught glimpses of staff hurrying past. Some offered sympathetic nods, their eyes conveying what words couldn't, while others avoided her gaze, their fear of hospital politics palpable. Emily understood their silence. The hospital was a machine, its gears oiled by compliance and caution. No one wanted to be the next to face scrutiny. As she folded her stethoscope and tucked it into her bag, her thoughts drifted to Walt, the patient whose life she'd saved. Would he remember her face when he woke? Would anyone tell him the cost she'd paid to keep his heart beating? A sharp knock at the door startled her. Deborah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face a mask of professional detachment. "You're expected at the administration office at noon," she said curtly. Emily nodded, rising without a word, her movements deliberate. As she approached the door, Deborah hesitated, her voice softening just enough to betray a flicker of unease. "You put this hospital in a very difficult position," she added. Emily met her supervisor's gaze, her own eyes calm but unflinching. "No," she said evenly. "I put a heartbeat back in that man's chest." With that, she brushed past Deborah, the break room door swinging shut behind her, its soft thud echoing like a gavel. In that moment, Emily knew the real battle was just beginning. The conference room reeked of stale coffee and lemon disinfectant, the air heavy with the weight of bureaucracy. Emily sat at one end of the long table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture composed but her senses sharp. Across from her sat the review panel, the hospital administrator, a man in his 50s with thinning gray hair and a perpetually furrowed brow. The head of HR whose tight smile betrayed her discomfort. A legal advisor, a younger woman with piercing eyes and a pen that never stopped moving. And Deborah, the chief nurse, whose expression remained as unreadable as ever. The administrator cleared his throat, shuffling a stack of papers as if the answers lay buried in their margins. "Nurse Harper, you understand why we're here today," he began, his voice measured but tinged with unease. Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "I understand you're questioning why I saved a man's life." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unapologetic, and a ripple of tension passed through the room. Deborah leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "This isn't about the outcome, Emily," she said, her tone clipped. "It's about procedure. You stepped outside your assigned floor. You intervened without authorization." Emily drew a slow, deliberate breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her conviction. "And if I hadn't, Walter Briggs would be dead right now," she replied, her voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of steel. The legal advisor tapped her pen against her folder, her eyes narrowing. "The hospital is liable when staff act beyond their scope of assignment," she said crisply. "This isn't just a question of ethics. It's a question of risk management." The words struck Emily like a slap. igniting a familiar warmth in her chest, the kind that flared whenever someone reduced medicine to spreadsheets and liability clauses. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with the advisor's. "When you hire a nurse, you hire someone trained to respond to emergencies," she said, her voice steady but resonant. "We don't get to schedule cardiac arrests. We don't get to choose when a life hangs in the balance. I did what I was trained to do, what I've done for 30 years. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the panel like a fog. The administrator coughed, his fingers fidgeting with his papers as he tried to regain control of the meeting. "We'll be reviewing the incident thoroughly," he said, his voice strained. But Emily barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment she'd found Walt, his face ashen, his pulse fading. She'd acted on instinct, her training overriding protocol, her heart overriding fear. And now, as she sat before this panel, she knew she'd make the same choice again, no matter the cost. The fight for her career, and for what she believed in, had only just begun. As Emily stood in the dimly lit hallway of Golden Pines Community Hospital, the weight of her suspension hung heavy in her chest, a knot of uncertainty twisting tighter with every passing second. The administrator's words still echoed in her mind: security footage, staff interviews, protocol violations. Her career, a tapestry woven with years of dedication, seemed to teeter on the edge of unraveling. Yet, as she glanced through the glass pane of the office door, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A tall man stood in the corridor, his silhouette framed by the fluorescent lights. He wore a weathered leather jacket and a cowboy hat tilted just so, his posture rigid yet purposeful, like a soldier who'd seen more than most. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and in that instant, Emily felt a spark of curiosity ignite within her, pushing back against the dread. He gave a single deliberate nod before turning away, his phone pressed to his ear as he disappeared down the hall. Who was he? What did he know? The questions buzzed in her mind, refusing to settle. Back in the locker room, Emily moved with deliberate slowness, each item she packed carrying the weight of memory. Her stethoscope, cool and familiar in her hands, had listened to countless heartbeats, each one a story of survival or struggle. The old mug, chipped at the rim, still held the faint echo of late-night coffee and whispered conversations with colleagues. The thank you cards, neatly folded and tucked away, were tokens of gratitude from patients whose lives she'd touched. As she gathered these pieces of her past, the muffled sounds of the hospital seeped through the walls, call buttons chiming, announcements crackling over the intercom, the hurried tap of footsteps. Slipping her coat over her shoulders, Emily paused, her heart caught between fear and hope. Was this the end of everything she'd worked for, or the cusp of something entirely unexpected? The uncertainty clung to her, but so did a quiet resolve, a whisper that maybe this wasn't the final chapter. The next morning, the air in Golden Pines Community Hospital buzzed with an unfamiliar energy, a blend of tension and intrigue that seemed to hum through the corridors. Nurses and orderlies huddled near the station, their whispers sharp and fleeting, their glances darting toward the administrative wing. Word had spread like wildfire. Someone important was on site. Emily, who had returned only to clear out the last remnants of her locker, felt the shift the moment she stepped through the hospital's glass doors. Heads turned, eyes lingered, not with judgment, but with something else, something curious. A young orderly, his face flushed with urgency, nearly collided with her in his haste. "Emily, you need to see this," whispered Janice, her colleague, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the conference room. At the end of the hall stood a figure who seemed to command the space without effort. Colonel Robert Mason, in a crisp military dress uniform, was a striking presence. His silver hair gleamed beneath a polished cap, his boots shone like mirrors, and the medals pinned to his chest caught the light with every measured movement. He stood tall, exuding authority, yet there was a quiet steadiness in his demeanor that put Emily at ease even from a distance. Her heart skipped, a mix of awe and apprehension swirling within her. Inside the conference room, the administrator's voice faltered, betraying his unease. "Colonel Mason, we appreciate your concern, but this is an internal matter," he said, his words clipped and cautious. Mason raised a hand not to silence but to anchor the moment. His voice, low and resolute, cut through the room's tension like a blade. I understand Nurse Harper's suspension was for acting beyond her assigned duties, but I'm here to tell you that the man she saved is Staff Sergeant Walter Briggs. 3 tours in the Korean War, a Purple Heart, a Silver Star. Without Nurse Harper's actions, he wouldn't be here today. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Papers shuffled, someone coughed, but no one dared interrupt. Deborah Clean, the head nurse who'd pushed for Emily's suspension, sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes fixed on the table. The legal advisor's pen hovered motionless above her notepad, as if she too felt the gravity of the moment. Mason reached into his pocket and placed a small velvet box on the table, sliding it forward with deliberate care. Sergeant Briggs gave this nation everything he had, he continued, his voice steady but laced with conviction. Nurse Harper gave him something back, his life. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. Emily, watching from the doorway, felt her breath catch. The colonel's words weren't just a defense. They were a declaration, a call to honor the courage of those who act when it matters most. Her chest tightened, not with fear now, but with a swell of pride and disbelief. She'd saved a life, yes, but to hear it framed this way, by a man who carried the weight of wars and sacrifice, made her actions feel monumental. The administrator cleared his throat, his voice softer now, almost conciliatory. We'll review the footage again and revisit the suspension, he said, his eyes flickering toward Deborah, who remained silent. Colonel Mason's gaze shifted, finding Emily's through the glass. His nod was subtle, but to her it felt like a silent pact, a recognition that transcended the room's politics. As she turned to leave, the hallway seemed brighter, the faces around her softer. The whispers that followed her were no longer tinged with suspicion, but with something warmer. Respect, perhaps, or admiration. For the first time in days, Emily felt a small, tentative smile tug at her lips. Something had changed, not just in her, but in the very air of the hospital. By that afternoon, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. Emily returned, no longer as a nurse packing away her past, but as someone summoned to be heard. In the conference room, the administrator greeted her with a smile that was stiff but cautious, as if he were navigating unfamiliar terrain. Deborah Clean sat with her hands clasped tightly, her usual sharpness dulled, her eyes avoiding Emily's. The legal advisor barely looked up from her notes, her pen moving in quick, nervous strokes. At the head of the table sat Colonel Mason, his presence a steady anchor amidst the room's unease. His military posture was unshaken, his expression calm but expectant. Harper, the administrator began, his voice measured. We've reviewed the footage and the testimonies. He paused, glancing at Deborah, who remained silent. In light of new context, your suspension is lifted. We recognize that your intervention was critical in saving Mr. Briggs's life. Emily nodded, her arms resting calmly on the table, but inside, her heart pounded with a mix of relief and vindication. She'd fought for her patient, and now that fight was being acknowledged. But Colonel Mason wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice quiet yet unyielding. That's not enough, he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much to tolerate half measures. Recognition matters, not just for Nurse Harper, but for every member of your staff. They need to know that doing what's right outweighs following a rigid checklist. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the administrator, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For a moment, silence reigned, heavy with the truth of Mason's words. Then the administrator nodded, his voice quieter now. We agree. We'll review our emergency protocols to allow greater flexibility during life-threatening situations. Emily exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The room felt lighter, as if the weight of bureaucracy had been lifted, if only for a moment. She glanced at Colonel Mason, whose steady presence had shifted the tide in her favor. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that look she saw not just gratitude, but a shared understanding. A recognition of the courage it takes to stand firm in the face of rules, to choose a life over protocol. As she left the room, the hospital felt different, its walls no longer closing in, but opening to possibility. Emily's steps were lighter, her heart steadier. Whatever came next, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Emily stood at the edge of the conference room, her fingers gripping the table's edge, her knuckles whitening under the strain. She had prepared herself for another battle with Deborah Clean, the chief nurse whose unyielding adherence to protocol had always felt like an impenetrable barrier. Emily's heart pounded, a mix of exhaustion and defiance, as she anticipated more resistance. But then, to her astonishment, Deborah's stern gaze softened, and she offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so small yet so profound that Emily felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. For weeks she had carried the weight of uncertainty, the fear that her 30 years of service might end in a quiet, bureaucratic dismissal. But now, as Colonel Mason reached into his jacket pocket, the room seemed to hum with a new possibility. He placed a folded letter on the table, his fingers brushing the paper with a reverence that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. "This," he said, his voice steady but infused with warmth, "is from the Briggs family." He tapped the letter gently as if it held not just words but the weight of the life restored. "They want you to know you didn't just save a veteran. You saved a father, a grandfather, a man who gave everything for his country. They're grateful, more than words can ever express." Emily's chest tightened, not with the familiar ache of fatigue, but with a surge of purpose that felt like a fire rekindled. She met the colonel's gaze, and in his steady eyes she saw the same quiet pride she'd witnessed in countless soldiers over the years, men and women who had fought for something greater than themselves. As she shook his hand, his grip was firm, grounding, a silent testament to the battle she'd fought, not just for her patient, but for the very soul of the hospital she'd called home for 3 decades. Stepping out of the conference room, the hospital corridors felt different, as if the walls themselves had exhaled a long-held breath. The fluorescent lights, once harsh and unyielding, seemed to cast a softer glow, and the staff, who had once averted their eyes or whispered behind cupped hands, now looked at her with a new respect. Some offered small nods, others faint smiles, but all carried a recognition that hadn't been there before. For Emily, this wasn't just about reclaiming her job. It was about restoring the heartbeat of a place that had shaped her life, a place where every chart, every patient, every late-night shift had woven itself into her identity. Each step she took toward the ICU felt like a reclaiming of her purpose, a quiet vow to keep fighting for what mattered most. Her badge, clipped firmly to her scrubs, no longer felt like a burden but a badge of honor, a symbol of the battles she'd fought and won. She paused outside room 214, her heart quickening as she peered through the glass. Walt Briggs sat propped up in his hospital bed, his face pale but alive with a spark that hadn't been there days ago. His Korean War veteran cap rested on the tray table beside him, its faded fabric a testament to a life of service and sacrifice. His son, Tom, sat nearby, his cowboy hat tipped back as he leaned forward, his voice low but animated, weaving a story that coaxed a soft chuckle from Walt. The old soldier's eyes, sharp despite the weight of years, danced with quiet amusement, and Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she endured the endless paperwork, the grueling shifts, the constant battles with hospital bureaucracy. It was for moments like these, when life flickered back into someone's eyes, when a family's story continued because of her hands, her heart. She tapped lightly on the doorframe, and Tom's head turned, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Walt's gaze followed, and recognition lit up his weathered features, his eyes bright with a gratitude that needed no words. "You," he rasped, his voice thin but steady, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much, yet still held on to hope. "You're the one they told me about." Emily stepped inside, her hands moving instinctively to check the IV line, her touch gentle but precise, as if every adjustment was a small act of devotion. "Just doing my job, Mr. Briggs," she said, her smile soft but sincere, a shield against the emotions welling up inside her. Walt's hand, frail and speckled with age, reached for hers. His grip was surprisingly strong, a reminder of the resilience that had carried him through wars and decades of life. "I pulled men out of burning trucks," he murmured, his eyes misting with memories of jungles and gunfire, of comrades lost and saved. "Dragged friends out of hell. Never thought someone would pull me back one day." Emily squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a connection that transcended words, a bond forged in the quiet moments of care. "That's how it works, Walt," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "We look out for each other." Tom, standing quietly by the bed, gave her a small nod, his eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude before he slipped out of the room, leaving them in a moment that felt sacred, untouchable. As Emily stood there, the weight of the past few days, the accusations, the suspension, the fear of losing everything she'd built, began to dissolve. In Walt's eyes, she saw the truth she'd always carried in her heart. This work was about people, about the invisible threads that wove lives together, about the moments that made every sacrifice worthwhile. When she stepped back into the corridor, she found Deborah waiting near the nurse's station. The chief nurse's usual rigidity had softened, her shoulders less squared, her expression less guarded, as if the weight of her own convictions had begun to lift. For a moment they stood in silence, the air heavy with the unspoken history of their clashes. Then Deborah spoke, her voice quieter than Emily had ever heard it, laced with a vulnerability that caught her off guard. "Emily," she began, hesitating as if the words were unfamiliar territory, "I owe you an apology, a public one." Before Emily could respond, Deborah turned to the gathered nurses who had paused in the midst of their shift change, their eyes curious and attentive. Her voice rose, clear and deliberate, cutting through the hum of the hospital. "Everyone, I need to acknowledge something. Nurse Harper's actions saved a life this week, and I was wrong to punish her for it. Starting today, we will revise our emergency protocols." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the staff like a tide. Then one nurse began to clap, a tentative sound that grew as others joined in, until the hallway echoed with applause, a chorus of recognition that filled Emily's chest with a warmth she hadn't expected. Her face flushed, her throat tightening with a surge of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a quiet pride that she hadn't felt in days. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt truly home, not just in the hospital, but in the community of people who had seen her fight and now stood with her, their hands clapping in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. A month later, the hospital had transformed. The emergency protocols had been rewritten, the staff retrained, and a new energy pulsed through the corridors, vibrant and alive. The chatter at the nurses' station was warmer now, filled with laughter and the easy camaraderie of a team that had faced a storm together and emerged stronger, more united. On the ICU whiteboard, in bold blue marker, were the words, "The Emily Code," a new standard that empowered any qualified nurse to act in life-threatening emergencies, no matter their assigned ward. It was more than a policy, it was a testament to what they'd fought for, a reminder that courage and compassion could reshape even the most rigid systems. Emily walked the familiar hallway, a fresh cup of coffee warming her hands, her steps slower but filled with purpose. The hospital felt alive again, its heartbeat steady and strong, a reflection of the people who kept it beating. As she passed room 214, she couldn't help but glance inside. Walt Briggs was gone, discharged 2 weeks earlier to return to his family, his arms full of thank you letters for the staff who had fought for him. In his place, a small framed photo now hung on the wall. Walt standing in his backyard, surrounded by his grandchildren, his grin wide beneath his faded Korean War cap, his eyes bright with the joy of a life reclaimed. Below it, a handwritten note read, "To Nurse Emily Harper, with all our gratitude." Emily's smile was quiet but deep, her heart full as she continued down the hall, her coffee cup warm in her hands, her badge steady against her chest. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had helped change not just a life, but the very heart of the place she called home. Emily Harper adjusted the badge pinned to her scrub top, its familiar weight grounding her as she moved through the quiet halls of Golden Pines Community Hospital. The faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors accompanied her steps, a rhythm she'd known for 3 decades. Outside, on the hospital's front lawn, a new flagpole stood tall, a gift from Walt Briggs's family and a group of local veterans. At its base, a polished brass plaque gleamed in the morning light, inscribed with words that carried a quiet power, in honor of those who serve and those who save. Each dawn, the maintenance crew raised the American flag in a simple, reverent ceremony, the stars and stripes unfurling against the vast Montana sky. If Emily timed her coffee break just right, she'd stand on the lawn, steaming mug in hand, watching the flag climb higher as the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon. Those moments, brief as they were, felt like a small rebellion against the chaos of her days, a chance to breathe, to reflect, to feel the weight of everything she'd fought for. The past few weeks had been a grueling marathon. Heated debates in sterile conference rooms, skeptical glares from hospital administrators, mountains of paperwork that seemed to multiply overnight, and late nights spent poring over policies had tested her resolve. There were moments when Emily questioned whether her push for change was worth the exhaustion, the sideways glances from colleagues who preferred the old ways, the endless bureaucratic hurdles. But now, as she walked her rounds, she could feel the shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable current of change rippling through the hospital. It wasn't just the new flagpole or the updated protocols. It was the way people carried themselves, the way they looked to her not just as a seasoned nurse, but as a beacon of what was possible. Younger nurses now sought her out, their eyes wide with a mix of admiration and curiosity. They asked for her advice on handling tough cases, navigating hospital politics, or simply staying steady when the job felt like too much. Emily remembered her own early days, the uncertainty that gnawed at her when she was their age, and she poured herself into mentoring them, offering not just technical know-how, but the kind of wisdom that only years of bedside battles could teach. Even Deborah Klein, the hospital's notoriously rigid chief administrator, had softened. Once Deborah would have dismissed Emily's ideas with a curt nod, but now she stopped by Emily's desk, her tone almost deferential as she asked for input on policy revisions. The first time it happened, Emily had to suppress a disbelieving laugh. Never in her career had she imagined Deborah seeking her out. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental, a crack in the wall of tradition that had long dictated how things were done. One crisp afternoon, as Emily sat at the nurse's station, her eyes scanning patient charts, a familiar figure approached. Tom Briggs, Walt's son, walked in, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying something heavier than the wooden box in his hands. His face lit up with a warm, weary smile when he saw her. "Dad wanted you to have this," he said softly, placing the box on the counter with a care that suggested its contents were sacred. Emily's heart thudded as she lifted the lid. Inside lay Walt's Korean war cap, its fabric meticulously cleaned, its stitches worn but proud, alongside a neatly folded American flag and a handwritten note. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper. Walt's shaky script coming into focus. "Thank you for being the one who didn't wait." The words hit her like a wave, stirring a tangle of emotions, gratitude, pride, and a deep, aching sorrow for all the moments when waiting had cost too much. She traced the cap's faded emblem, her mind flooding with memories of Walt's frail form in the hospital bed, his stubborn spirit fighting through the haze of pain. She looked up at Tom, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears, and they shared a quiet nod, a silent understanding of what this gesture meant. When Tom left, Emily sat alone, the weight of the box grounding her. She thought about how change, real change, didn't come from sweeping proclamations or flashy initiatives. It came from one person choosing to act, to defy the rules when they clashed with what was right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden rays across the polished hallway floor, Emily stood, squared her shoulders, and tucked Walt's cap into her locker with a reverence reserved for relics. There would be more patients, more crises, more moments when instinct would have to override protocol. But because of one choice, her choice, the hospital was ready. And so was she. In the weeks that followed, Golden Pines felt like a place reborn, each day a new page in a story still being written. Emily had been asked to chair the newly formed Emergency Response Committee, a role that felt both daunting and exhilarating. The committee was tasked with overhauling the hospital's emergency protocols, now officially dubbed the Emily Code, a name that made her cheeks flush with equal parts pride and embarrassment. For the first time in her 30-year career, she wasn't just saving lives at the bedside, she was shaping how lives would be saved across the entire hospital. Meetings were held at odd hours, early mornings before the first coffee break, or late afternoons when most staff were dreaming of dinner. But Emily was there for everyone, sleeves rolled up, notebook open, her pen scribbling idea as fast as they came. She didn't just want the input of doctors and nurses. She sought out the voices rarely heard, orderlies who knew the hospital's rhythm better than anyone, janitors who saw things others missed. Their perspectives, raw and unfiltered, were the foundation of the changes she envisioned. One morning, standing before a room of nurses, Emily presented the new procedures on a projector screen, flashing real-life case simulations. Her voice was steady but fierce as she spoke. "What matters is not waiting," she told them, her eyes sweeping the room. "When you see someone in distress, you move, you act. A human life doesn't care about your department or your job title." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Then a young nurse from pediatrics raised her hand, her voice tentative but clear. "I used to hesitate if it wasn't my floor," she admitted. "I won't anymore." Emily's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. That was the point. Beyond the hospital walls, the world seemed to shift too. The flagpole by the entrance had become a quiet symbol of change, its flag snapping in the Montana breeze each morning as a small group of local veterans gathered to watch it rise. Sometimes Emily caught them glancing toward the hospital, their weathered hands tipping their caps when they spotted her through the glass doors. It was a gesture that carried more meaning than any speech, a silent nod to her role in honoring not just Walt, but all who served. Walt's family had woven themselves into the fabric of the hospital community. Tom Briggs became a familiar face, dropping off coffee for the night shift or trays of homemade pastries for the staff, his quiet generosity a reminder of his father's spirit. Walt himself, now recovering at home, would call Emily from time to time, his voice crackling with warmth as he shared stories of chasing his grandkids around the yard. Slowly, he admitted with a chuckle, but still chasing. Each call left Emily smiling, her heart a little lighter. One afternoon, after a particularly long shift, Emily found herself walking the hospital grounds, something she rarely had time for in the past. She paused beneath the flagpole, her eyes tracing the flag's gentle ripples in the wind. Standing there, she thought of the old rules, the ones etched into dusty policy binders, was unchallenged for years. She thought of the fear that had once held people back, herself included, from doing what was right because it wasn't procedure. The sky glowed with hues of pink and gold as the sun sank lower, and Emily took a deep breath, the cool air sharp in her lungs. There was still so much to do, policies to rewrite, young nurses to guide through moments of crisis, systems to fix, but now there was a framework, a path forward. As she turned to head back inside, a quiet confidence settled in her chest, warm and steady. Golden Pines Community Hospital, the place she'd poured her life into, had rediscovered its purpose. And Emily Harper, after 30 years of service, hadn't just saved a life. She'd helped save the soul of the hospital itself.